Hello, good morning. Hi. Welcome back to day 2 of the Depression on College Campuses conference. We had a great number of sessions yesterday, and we're looking forward to another fantastic day, beginning with our panel this morning, Mental Health Disability on Campus, Epidemiology, Evaluation, Accommodation, and Transitions. You should have received note cards when you came in. If not, we'll have some staff walking around with note cards where you can write your questions, and the panel is going to be moderated by Dr. Dorothy Gotlib this morning, so we'll bring your questions up and she'll present them to the panelists. You'll hear about each of the panelists as we go along, but briefly, we have Miss Leah Goodman. She's an occupational therapist at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Phillip Saragoza, adjunct clinical professor in the Department of Michigan Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Victor Schwartz, he's the chief medical officer of the JED Foundation. And Dr. Stuart Segal, he's the director of the University of Michigan Services for Students with Disabilities. And now quickly just a bit about Dr. Gotlib, who's our moderator today. She is a staff psychiatrist at Counseling and Psychological Services at the University of Michigan. She completed both her general psychiatry residency and forensic psychiatry fellowship at the University of Michigan. Her clinical work at CAPS led her to become interested in how mental health disability standards are applied in higher education. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Dorothy Gotlib.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you to all of you for being here. It's a real pleasure to be with like-minded people who have similar interests, who are passionate about the same types of topics. I can sort of make out the audience with the bright lights, but just could I get a quick show of hands how many students we have in the room? Okay, a good number of students. How about people who would classify themselves as administrators or having some administrative role on a campus? And then how about therapists, psychiatrists, counselors? Yeah, and you can raise your hand twice. Okay, very good. So it's great we have such a multidisciplinary, diverse group, and likewise I'm presenting with a group that's multidisciplinary and diverse. So let's see. The point of this talk, so this talk actually, I started at Counseling and Psychological Services in 2016, and when I got there, after completing my forensic training, which was a year of subspecialty training in mental illness and the law, those kind of intersection, I showed up and I was really surprised to meet with a number of students who had clear mental health diagnoses that were obviously impairing their ability to function in the academic setting. You know, many of them would be students I met would be on academic probation or in jeopardy of not being able to continue their education. I was confused after all of my training in the area about what steps they needed to take to achieve some kind of accommodation, to understand the process for being evaluated regarding their disability. And I mean, not to mention, the first steps would have been just to get diagnosis and treatment and all of the different barriers they had to cross in order to have that effectively addressed. So when I saw the call for abstracts for this conference, I thought it was a great opportunity to pull together a panel of experts who have a number of different perspectives on this issue and see if we could not just bring awareness to this issue, but also have more transparency between psychiatrists, administrators, students, therapists, and so forth. And then also, lastly, hear from people who are at the cutting edge of this issue and making plans and curriculum and programs to address these types of things. So I don't believe anyone has any disclosures. And like I just said, this essentially summarizes that. The main goals are to bring awareness to the issue, transparency, and understand more about emerging approaches or what the plan is to deal with this type of problem. This slide I made is a roadmap, basically, to show you that the whole panel of speakers will be speaking and building on each other over the course of this talk. Each person will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we intend to have at least a half an hour at the end for question and answers. So as you do come up with any thoughts, questions, things you want explained further, jot them down on the card, and then one of us will be happy to take the question when the panel is done speaking. So this roadmap that I put together, like I said, describes a roadmap essentially of where we're going to go over the course of this talk. The bottom arrow shows that there's this high risk during the period between high school, college, and workplace in which students and individuals are uniquely susceptible for developing or having progression of mental illness, and there is a heightened need for observation and treatment, especially as it relates to periods of major transition, which we know to be quite destabilizing. So I intend to set the groundwork for the talk and discussing some epidemiological issues and bring more awareness to that, and then also introduce some issues touching on the various stakeholders and individuals who are involved in making a disability evaluation and the university's approach to dealing with that. When I'm done speaking, I'm going to introduce Phil Saragoza, who is also a forensic psychiatrist and an expert in mental health disability evaluations. He will speak about in more detail about the mental health disability evaluation, the process of the evaluation, and then Stuart Segal, who's the director of our Student Services with Disability Office, will talk about how the accommodations are formulated and the process students go through at his office. And then lastly, we have Leah Goodman and Victor Schwartz to speak about different programs that they're involved with to help mitigate the burden of mental health on students who are otherwise susceptible to having an associated impairment. It won't be surprising to any of you to see this data from the 2014 American College Health Association, over 94,000 students at 170 universities who indicate that this is obviously mental health. The burden is a significant problem for many of them, and we know this, and many people are trying to address it. The question that we are asking here is, to what extent is this impairing students' function academically? We know that is the case, and then how do we manage that problem? Comorbidities are also many issues that are largely comorbid, such as ADHD or exposure to substances, sexual assault, eating disorders, obviously make for an environment where, in the context of major transition and high rates of anxiety and depression, students are vulnerable to developing a disability that escalates to the level of, or an impairment that escalates to the level of disability. We also know that this time spanning high school, college, and workplace life shortly thereafter is the time when serious mental illness, such as bipolar or schizophrenia, typically are initially diagnosed. That's when their first onset is. And we know whether it's bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or depression and anxiety that these diagnoses are chronic and require management over time. I added this slide to show some of the developmental progression and basically highlight the fact that while the World Health Organization says depression will be the second leading cause of disability by 2020 in the entire population worldwide, we know that amongst young adults, ages 18 to 40, so obviously the population that we're talking about here, mental illness is already the second leading cause of limitation of activities. And here in the university, when we're asking people to function at such a high level in so many domains, and often for the first time independently, this presents a unique set of circumstances that have to be addressed. So as far as the mental health and campus intersection, and as I prepare to hand the microphone over to Phil Saragoza, I wanted to talk about the fact that this is not just that this is a big problem, it's that it's a growing problem. All of the surveys of counseling center directors, administrators on campus, and so forth acknowledge that number of students with serious mental health concerns on campus are growing. They know that it's well known that there are decreased graduation rates associated with this, and students are in some ways, at a very difficult position when they're oftentimes transplanted to a new place. Even for people who have significant amounts of resources in an environment such as Ann Arbor or other college towns, have a very difficult time accessing care, and let alone coming in and considering the fact that maybe their situation is escalated to the point that they're having trouble functioning, or that a disability accommodation might be warranted. I've met with a number of students where maybe they don't want to get treatment to begin with because it's unacceptable to them or their families, but then to consider to coordinate coming in and speaking about what's going on with them, let alone going to a separate office altogether where they don't know what's going to happen, can be very daunting. So the need to be a self-advocate and very acknowledging of the limitations that one is having or how much they're suffering is so critical. And then they have to navigate the situation in which they have their own interests. Their parents may have different interests. The counseling center has its own interests and ideas about what they're there to provide. The university SSD office likewise. So this is a tremendous issue for students to try to approach and get past. Stuart Segal will talk about this more, but essentially I wanted to talk also a little bit about these different perspectives before we move on. So we have the guiding principles that allow people accommodations, and the Americans with Disabilities Act which it's since been revised, but of 1990 is the main guiding force, and essentially learning has been acknowledged to be a major life activity, and therefore if there are impairments or something that's limiting learning, then someone can be considered as having a disability and therefore entitled to what they term reasonable accommodations that are intended to essentially level the playing field. So a role of an evaluating clinician, I think this slide actually is a little bit confusing if you don't consider the context that a treating clinician, their role would be to evaluate and treat any kind of mental health diagnosis and manage and make recommendations to help optimize someone's sense of well-being and whatever symptoms they're having. Whereas an evaluating clinician who's needing to determine to what extent someone has a disability would have to carefully consider, obviously, the tasks associated with being a nursing student who has to work overnight or for 16 hours straight in an operating room or something are very different than a student who has to regularly do public speaking or take standardized tests that are timed without much time. And so the clinician and in turn later the SSD office would have to carefully consider what the tasks are associated with what a student's trying to accomplish and whether or not there is an impairment that meets the level of a student not being able to complete the tasks, and then determine that if someone's impaired, what types of accommodations could alleviate the impairment. So for example, could the nurse simply complete the shifts in the morning so as not to dysregulate the sleep cycles, or could someone who's has a difficult time functioning in a large auditorium while taking a test, would that be alleviated if they were in a private room, for example, or had a different time requirement? But essentially the standard is that students who are otherwise capable of completing certain tasks would be entitled to equal opportunities to learn and demonstrate competence. And between the evaluating clinician and the SSD office, those determinations have to be made to highlight to what extent the situation is complicated and might be confusing for a student or a clinician, especially someone who doesn't have training in disability evaluations. You have so many different stakeholders. You have academic institutions who are oftentimes equipped to provide academic assistance and obviously facilitate learning and education, but then you have testing organizations, which so many programs require to go to various graduate programs and so forth, and their goal is to measure fairly and impartially to what extent learning has occurred. And they want to use a neutral objective standard. So there's a lot of different perspectives, situations complicated for someone who has extensive training in the area, let alone a student who's showing up on campus and being asked to get treatment, to find providers, to find evaluators, to apply in this office or that office. And so that is the groundwork for our presentation. I appreciate your attention to my portion of the talk. I'm going to hand the microphone over next to Phil Saragoza, who, like I said, is a general and forensic psychiatrist who is an adjunct clinical assistant professor at the University of Michigan Department of Psychiatry and has extensive experience and expertise, probably one of the most experienced people in this realm that you'll find, within a 50-mile radius, certainly. And look forward to hearing from him about what he has to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Dorothy. I'm not sure if that says more about me or more about who is within a 50-mile radius. Perhaps we'll figure that out over the next 10 minutes. So good morning, everybody. My name is Phil Saragoza. I'm a forensic psychiatrist. And building on what Dr. Gotlib said, this is an area of psychiatry that focuses on issues and evaluations that don't strictly relate to someone's clinical assessment and treatment. So we are in the business of assessing whether or not somebody might be eligible for certain benefits and answering particular questions to some third-party entity, often like a university. And I was asked to come and talk a little bit about mental health disability evaluations. What I want to cover for you in the next few minutes is the basic practical nuts and bolts type information on these assessments, so that if you're a student and you might need to have one of these evaluations done, you'll know what you're getting yourself into and know what to expect. And maybe if you're a clinician who's been drawn into this situation and asked to participate in it for one of your clients, you'll have more of an idea of what's being asked. So Dr. Gotlib introduced this idea briefly in her comments. Disability evaluations are distinct from clinical assessments, and I think we'll kind of start with what makes them different. In a clinical assessment, you present to a doctor with your symptoms and presumably some level of distress around having those symptoms in the first place. And the doctor is there to listen to you, to help you, to figure out whether or not you have a condition and a diagnosis, and if so, whether treatment is indicated for that, and what suggestions they might have to offer about how you could go about being treated for that condition. A disability evaluation is different. The focus is more to determine whether or not, yes, whether you have a condition, but more importantly, whether you have some kind of functional impairment stemming from that condition. And then to answer questions that some third party is asking, like, does this person have ADHD? And if so, do they require accommodations to be able to kind of equally participate in the educational environment? So while the clinical assessment is one where the doctor has a helping, supportive orientation toward the individual, a disability evaluator is, intended at least to be more objective and seeking to answer questions rather than necessarily just to help someone. And so another kind of distinction that's relevant in this discussion is the kind of difference between having a diagnosis and having a disability. Diagnosis refers to sort of a syndrome, a cluster of symptoms that fits with some known condition and may or may not warrant treatment, whereas disability refers to the idea that somebody, because of their condition, has specific impairments that might prevent them from fully participating in some activity, at least without the form of assistance like accommodations or restrictions. So as Dr. Gotlib introduced, accommodations are something that people are entitled to who might have a disability, and that stems from the Americans with Disabilities Act. And very simply, it's some kind of modification or maybe extra assistance that will allow that person to address the impairment and more fully participate in an activity. So for a student who might have a learning issue like ADHD, a common accommodation would be extended time on tests. And for somebody in the workplace who's out of school, but is being treated for some kind of condition, perhaps obsessive compulsive disorder, and they have an elaborate morning ritual that they go through, they might be able to get the accommodation of a flexible start time at work. A restriction is a limitation revolving around the idea that some kind of activity the student or worker is asked to do might actually exacerbate their condition. And so there's a compelling reason to have them not engage in that particular activity. Dr. Gotlib had mentioned, I hope that nursing students don't still do 16-hour shifts in the OR. I thought that we were supposed to stop doing things like that. But there may be somebody who has a condition that makes them vulnerable to circadian rhythm disruption, and they're therefore recommended to have the restriction of not working overnight shifts or varying shifts. So you can think about things like accommodations and restrictions as special requests. And so they have some potential value. And if you're a student and you think that you might qualify for an accommodation of something like extended time on tests, then there's some stakes there that are at play in seeking that kind of accommodation. And those stakes have the capacity by human nature to kind of influence how people present with their problem, okay? And so what disability evaluations are really focused on is that these third-party entities, like institutions of learning, we want people who need these benefits to get them, but they're also interested in making sure that they're not misused and that people who don't need accommodations or restrictions aren't being granted them. And so that's the purpose of having the evaluation done. And it does fall outside of the usual relationship of a treating clinician and a patient. So when we look at who performs these kinds of evaluations, sometimes treating clinicians do them. I've never met a treating clinician who is happy to be in the role because it can introduce different kinds of conflicts of interest. So for example, if the treating clinician doesn't agree with their patient that they need a certain accommodation or that they even have a certain condition, that can introduce an element of tension in the situation. And so frequently disability evaluations are done by someone independent, someone who does not have that kind of treatment-oriented relationship with the person. And in fact, depending upon what the third party is and what their ordinary protocols might be, they might have requirements about who can do the examination, who should do it, what their basic qualifications should be. And I've given an example where Social Security Disability actually asked for the treating clinician to be the first line provider of the information that will go toward determining whether or not the person gets disability benefits. So what a disability assessment entails is basically a comprehensive, thorough functional assessment. And I'm going to go through in the next few slides the kinds of information that an evaluator will often look at. One thing that is distinct from ordinary clinical practice is that disability evaluators look at a lot more information, and that includes collateral records. So that might be old treatment records. It might be records that refer to the person having previously had accommodations. So it would be very common for a college student who's applying for accommodations around something like ADHD. The evaluator ends up getting their school records from as far back as elementary school. Those things might include 504 plans. They might even include the notes from meetings that parents had with administrators in the school that describe the kinds of accommodations that were offered, how the student responded to those interventions. And the evaluator isn't just blindly reading these records, looking for a number of things, looking for whether or not the condition is substantiated, whether or not the person has had proper treatment, and if so, how they've responded to that treatment, and also paying attention to things like the details of those past accommodations and whether they were implemented and how successful that was. And if this information is consistent internally and across time, because again, something that's distinct from ordinary clinical work is not quite taking at face value whatever information the person is presenting to the examiner. And in terms of the evaluation itself, the face-to-face portion, there tends to be a little more focus on kind of richness of examples of functional impairment. So they've actually done some survey studies around whether or not doctors are good at asking about functional impairment. And ordinarily, we perform exceptionally poorly on those ratings. So I think that part of that is the managed care environment where a lot of times now if you go to a doctor, there's very limited time in the evaluation appointment. And so their focus is really driven toward figuring out if you've got symptoms that meet criteria for a diagnosis. They have to be able to document all that to justify their meeting with you and then to get to the point of being able to recommend treatment. There's not necessarily always time and space to develop a clearer sense of how that condition actually manifests and how it affects the person's functioning, but that is the content that the disability evaluator is more focused on. And so another thing that can sometimes help to elaborate on that are the use of measures and psychological tests. So self-report measures are one resource there. Those do have some usefulness. They offer kind of descriptions of ordinary manifestations of a given kind of condition and the ability for the person to sort of rate the extent to which the condition manifests that way for them. But that still relies on self-report. And as I said before, there can be different kinds of incentives going on that influence what someone is describing about themselves. And so one of the ways that that is managed in disability assessment is through administration of formal psychological testing. And that kind of testing often does include embedded kind of measures that check for whether or not someone is responding in a valid way. So they're able to gauge the relative accuracy of somebody's self-report. And certainly with things like cognitive functioning, you can actually get a quantitative measure of different types of mental tasks and how the person performs on those. So with all of this information being reviewed, with a functionality-focused interview and examination, with sometimes collateral interviews and this kind of testing that I've described, the net result of a disability evaluation is the production of information, and the kind of key document that stems from that is a disability report. And that report will often give the diagnosis, say what the functional impairment is, and try to kind of grade the severity of that in some way. And they may make recommendations about treatment, but ultimately, the focus is to answer the questions about whether or not the person qualifies for some kind of accommodation or benefit, and if so, what is the expected duration of that. So it would be really common if someone is being diagnosed with some type of learning disability, for example, that the examiner ends up saying, well, I think that they're going to need these accommodations for at least the next 3 or 4 years, kind of during that phase of their education, and then we might reassess and do repeat testing. But that's going to vary depending upon the nature of the condition. So once this report is done, it's usually one of several documents that get submitted to a place like a university. And the other things that might go along with it include the university might have their own administrative documents that the evaluator or the treating clinician have to fill out. And often those things will use language from the ADA. So when Dr. Gotlib mentioned that learning is an example of an essential function, there are other ones like listening. And the paperwork might actually list those kinds of functions and ask the doctor and kind of prompt them or cue them to describe how that functional impairment manifests for this individual. Sometimes the treating clinicians are also asked to kind of give a support letter and characterize their experience of working with a person and why they see the need for these kinds of accommodations that are being recommended. Whether or not the test results and other collateral information, including medical records, is submitted can vary depending upon the benefits that are at stake. So just to end by briefly kind of touching on the longitudinal idea that's underpinning this whole presentation. Disabilities don't end when people complete their schooling and go into the workforce, but there are a couple of differences in my experience between evaluations of disability that are oriented toward an educational setting versus the workplace. And it makes sense that educational oriented examinations most often focus on issues that affect learning a little more directly. So I see that it's very common that those evaluations entail psychological testing and that they recall previous records of the learning disability, how early it was documented, and the kinds of accommodations that people received. In the workplace setting, things more often shift toward a focus on mood and anxiety disorders. It's not that people who have something like ADHD stop having it when they become adults, but they tend to kind of figure out how their brain works and the kinds of organizational tools that they need to operate, and find themselves kind of self-accommodating in the workplace often. So these kind of, more mood-oriented issues are a much more common reason to have a disability evaluation in the workplace. And the kinds of accommodations and restrictions that get recommended based on those conditions are logically and necessarily different than you would be expecting from some kind of a learning disorder. So I'll kind of segue into allowing Stuart Segal to present to you. He's with the Student Services Disabilities Office and has a lot of expertise and can give you a richer description about the kind of nuts and bolts of accommodations and the legal foundation for those. Thanks.
Good morning. Now that I'm standing up, I can actually see you. Under the lights, I felt like I was, in the police headquarters getting the 5th degree. I really appreciate you having me this morning and being part of this panel. I'm supposed to sort of provide some clarity into an area that has a lot of muddiness to it. So I don't know whether I'll be successful if I continue your muddiness or whether I'm actually able to provide a little clarity to you in the next 10 minutes. What I want to do is try to give you a context for the accommodation process and for why we do what we do. Because a lot of you, if you've ever dealt with a disability office such as mine or at another university, we sometimes seem to draw funny and arbitrary lines that aren't always understandable. And I want to try to get to you to understand why we might do the things we do, even though it doesn't seem sensical, or even though an accommodation that somebody is looking for might seem that it might be helpful, that we still aren't able to do it. So the first thing I want you to do is understand the context of the different laws that apply, particularly at the post-secondary setting. So let me see if that... There are really 3 laws that apply to this. I want to make sure you can hear me. 2 of these laws are specifically aimed at post-secondary and employment. One of these is really aimed at K through 12. The earliest federal law is really a part of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Part of that law, known as Section 504, was really aimed at post-secondary education. That law just simply states that if you receive any federal money directly or indirectly, you must provide accommodations for individuals with disabilities. That law is still in effect. And for many of you, I know yesterday when I was sitting in the audience, there were people from high schools here. And one of the interesting historical effects is that many times now we're talking about 504 plans. And I just wanted to give you a little history as to how those developed. Because what people don't realize, if you go back 20 or 25 years ago, you would never have found a 504 plan in a high school, in an elementary school, or a middle school. They didn't exist. What existed was the first law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDA. That act was originally a 1974 law called the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. And there's differences between that law and the 504 and the ADA that I'll talk about in a minute. But the point being is states were allowed to come up with their own criteria for who was admitted into special education. Now, one of the things I will tell you is if the goodies or the accommodations or the services that are provided under the IDEA and under this handicapped children's law were much broader, much more significant than what you're going to get either with 504 or the ADA, and I'll explain that in a minute. And because of that, these laws sometimes have sent ripples into the future of expectations that aren't going to be met and really might disappoint families and students. But the idea is that as resources and as our economy changed, more and more money was being put into special education budgets. So much so that they became so overwhelming that states try to control that spending by changing the laws and making it much more difficult to get into special education. The bars were set higher and higher and higher for all the different disability groups. Parents, being the good advocates that they are, when that happened and their children were being denied services, found an alternative route to get accommodations. Not as many accommodations, not as many services, but still to get their students what it is they felt they needed. Thus was born the 504 plan in elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. And that came about because of decreasing special education budgets and an increase in the threshold in which was needed in order to get into the programs. Part of the reasons for that, and that budget, the special education budget, was further sort of axed, if you will, by the nexus between the No Child Left Behind Act and this special education. Because many of you may not know this, but part of the No Child Left Behind Act said that programs that schools developed could be paid for by taking funds out of the special education budget. So it further reduced the budget that was already being strangled. With that, you get the growth of the 504 plan. Now, the main thing I want you to understand, and it'll be in the next slide, is the difference between those two laws. The IDEA is an entitlement act. Both 504 and ADA are civil rights legislations. And on one hand, it doesn't seem to be much of a difference, but on the other, the difference is profound. In an entitlement act, such as the IDEA, it is the institution's responsibility to go out and find those students who are not performing, underperforming, provide whatever assessment and evaluation is needed, and then provide whatever remediation, equipment, services are required to help that situation. So it provides a whole range of services, starting from diagnostic to interventions. So you can see that might be costly depending on the threshold that we use. All of that changes. That law ends upon graduation. What's going to give you protection after that are these two civil rights laws, 504 and the ADA. And the idea of a civil rights legislation is that you are entitled to equity. You are entitled to be treated like everyone else and not to be discriminated against on the basis of your condition. The main difference between those is that the responsibility shifts 180%. It shifts from the institution to the individual. Nobody is legally protected with a disability under ADA or 504 until they come forward and say, I have this condition, I need these accommodations, and here is current documentation demonstrating that I have a current impairment which meets the federal definition of a disability. And until you do that, you have no legal protections. And that's important because oftentimes at colleges, and understandably so, students don't want to they've had this albatross of this label, and they said, look, I get into the University of Michigan, this must not be impairing me. This must not be so bad. And then all of a sudden they come into classes, they don't do as well as they want, and then they want the faculty to then go back and give them an accommodation on a test that they didn't do well on. And unfortunately, we're unable to do that for the reasons I've just stated. Earlier I said I talked about the ripples of sort of moving forward. Students coming to an institution, whether it's Michigan or any other post-secondary institution, who they're coming from the experience of the IDEA, where it was the institution's responsibility to provide all of these various services, aren't schooled very well to understand that that responsibility is going to shift, and the degree of services that are provided under a Civil Rights Act are much more limited. So you can understand that families and students may be extremely disappointed and frustrated when they come from an IDEA environment and expect that same range of services when they walk into a post-secondary environment. And then we have to try to explain to them why it is they might not be getting the range of stuff that they were getting previously. So really the difference between entitlement and civil rights, the main thing I want to focus on is that idea of the shift in responsibility. Okay, and this is the definition of a reasonable accommodation. I'll give you a second to read it. I'm not going to read it. What I do want to make a couple of points is that all accommodations are based on documented need. And this is where the need for the evaluation is so critical. Because diagnosis alone does not get you accommodations. What will get somebody an accommodation, whether it's in a post-secondary environment, an employment environment, or a high-stakes testing environment, is evidence of a substantial limitation in a major life activity. And that's really the bar that we'll be looking for. And a lot of times, what may be difficult, again, it really does get complicated, because even that bar may be different to different people. There are a lot of evaluators who are out there, very well-meaning, who sort of make the argument that this person may be impaired, but the evidence or the data they're giving us doesn't demonstrate what it is they're trying to say. And that puts us in a difficult spot, because we're trying to be fair, reasonable, and equitable to all individuals. And that's why evaluations with good data are so critical. Because to even further complicate this issue, and I don't have a slide on it, is the notion of the average person standard. So there is legal acceptance that if your performance in any area is within the average range, and for those of you who are more statistically minded, between a -1 and a +1 standard deviation, if your performance is in that range, you have no impairment, and you are not entitled to any accommodations. Now, luckily, most universities are much more flexible than that, but a lot of high-stakes testing and employers may not be. So that's where it gets really complicated, because we have cases of students getting accommodations throughout their entire life. They finally apply for a high-stakes testing, or finally apply to an employment situation expecting an accommodation, and then they're denied and they don't understand why. So all accommodations are based on documented need. And usually the way this happens, just to sort of what happens here, a student will come in with their documentation, they'll meet with a coordinator in the disability office, and we'll engage in what is termed the interactive process. That we'll look at the documentation, we'll look at the evidence of impairment, and based on that evidence of impairment, discuss what might be reasonable and appropriate accommodations. The goal of all accommodations, and this is the lens to keep trying to look through, is equity of access. That all individuals are entitled to be treated the same, regardless of any disability they may have. So our goal is always to give a student the same access as all other students. And that's the idea of an accommodation is to help ameliorate or to sort of compensate the impairment. So one broad statement, and this is a broad statement, so I take it with a grain of salt. Any accommodation that you may be requesting that would benefit all individuals, there's a good chance that's not a legally mandated accommodation. The idea of an accommodation is it's going to help the impairment to give you the equal access that you need. Now, a lot of people wonder, why is the number one accommodation extended time? Why is that so powerful? And the reason is why it's so powerful is that many of the conditions, and here we're talking about mental health conditions, many mental health conditions have cognitive sequelae. If you can look back in your own lives, there are periods where we've all been depressed, down, anxious. When you put yourself into those moments, think about what was being affected other than your mood, your ability to focus, to concentrate, to remember, to make decisions, to recall information, are all being compromised. The idea of giving you extended time is to give you the time you need to work through all of that interference so that you can produce your best possible answer in the classroom or on the evaluative project that you're working on. Extended time doesn't help everyone. Extended time does not give you knowledge. If you don't know what the question, I could give you all the time you want, you're still not going to get it right. The idea is we want to know what you know, and if giving you more time allows that, that's why we're going to give you extended time. The idea of an accommodation is that we want it to be effective. And we use the word, this is not my sort of stuff, we use the word effective as opposed to preference. A lot of people have preferences about how they would like things to be done. We don't necessarily have to give you your preference. What we do need to do is provide something that is effective. The way I heard one lawyer explain it was, we don't need to give you a Mercedes-Benz if a Ford will work. So the idea is it must be effective. So here's some examples of reasonable accommodations, just so that you get an idea. So it might be, again, extensions on short-term assignments, more time to complete tests, more time to complete your program or your coursework, the ability to tape record or get some assistance around note-taking, maybe getting your textbooks on e-text, getting other note-taking assistance, taking your tests in quieter rooms, or depending on the disability, if you need the test done in, say, a bigger format, or if you need the test put onto a tape. Those types of accommodations, those are reasonable and appropriate, depending on the impairment again. And this is probably one of the more important slides, because this is where we sometimes draw those funny lines that people might get frustrated with us. And that is, what academic accommodations are not required? The first one, and the most important one, is that it would fundamentally alter the nature of the program, the class. 2, when the academic requirements are essential to a program of study or to meet licensing requirements. So all the people you see up here all are licensed in one form or another. We don't need to make any modifications to that process. You need to be able to do what it is, whatever the program says that you need to do to meet licensing requirements or certification requirements of the state, whether that's be in teaching, medicine, psychology, occupational therapy, all of those. And a lot of programs have what are known as technical standards. And you must be able to meet those technical standards. And if you can't, then in essence you become not otherwise qualified to be in the program. Now this is where I, to sort of get an understanding of how this gets complicated and how there are things that I realize that students could use that our office isn't able to put into our letters. So you take somebody who's depressed. They're so depressed, in fact, they can't go to class. They just can't get out of bed. Depending on the level and the depth of the mood disorder, that may last a day, it may last a week, it may last even longer. Where a lot of people want us to be able to excuse those absences. If a class has an attendance policy, that becomes an essential feature of the class, and I am unable to make any modifications regarding that. Even though it's perfectly understandable and I get it, I'm still not able to do it. It's beyond what my capabilities are. I can't do any fundamental alterations. Schools, faculty are entitled to have what are the essential features or functions of their classrooms. The other sort of way that something may not be required is if it would be an undue burden. Quite honestly, at this institution, that has no meaning, and I'll tell you why. Because if we were to argue that what you want costs too much, and you filed a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, they wouldn't look at the SSD budget. They wouldn't even look at the budget in the part of the university that I exist in, student life. They would look at the entirety of the University of Michigan's budget, including Michigan Medical, which taken into consideration is over billions of dollars. And for anybody to argue that we can't buy a piece of equipment that's $10,000 when we have a multi-billion-dollar budget would be ludicrous. So nobody has ever turned down an accommodation because it would be a financial burden. It's either because they don't have the documentation to support the need for it, or it's a fundamental alteration. Those are the two reasons why people would be denied an accommodation. Finally, I want to put some sort of meat on the bones, if you will, regarding students specifically with mental health disabilities. This is just a bar graph showing the number of students registered in our office with mental health disabilities and how that has gone from 2012 to 2017 from 438 to 770. Another way of looking at that is that represents about a 57% increase in those 5 years. Now, also take into consideration that continues to go up even this year. Currently, we have over 2,700 students registered with the Office of Services for Students with Disabilities. Approximately 7% of all students on this campus are registered with the SSD office. That includes undergraduate, graduate, and professional schools. This is occurring at the same time that budgets are being cut. Just to give you an example, just our operational budget, not our overall budget, but the operational budget of what it takes to sort of run the day-to-day office. When I first took over as interim director back in 2007, I had an operational budget of $32,000. I was servicing probably at that time 800 students. Today, my operational budget is around $18,000, and I'm now servicing 2,700 students. So not only are we seeing more, we're trying to do more with significantly less. And this is the total percent of students with mental health conditions registered with us. And that is currently 30% of all that, 30% of that 2,700 are students with mental health disabilities, and that number continues to rise. I thank you for your time, and now it's my pleasure to introduce Leah Goodman, Dr. Leah Goodman.
Hello? Let me lower this. So we've heard a lot about disability on campus. You're here, you know that students are having more distress than they have in the past. But we're also seeing that more students with disabilities, as Stuart mentioned, more students with disabilities, and particularly psychiatric disabilities, are being admitted into universities than ever before. And so from a social justice perspective, this is an amazing thing, right? It means more equitable access to education. But it also means now that universities inherit the responsibility of adapting curriculums, of adapting spaces and places to meet the needs of these changing populations. So if you look at some of these statistics and listen to the things that people have been talking about at this conference, we can see that we're not doing such a good job. And this is particularly problematic because for adults with disabilities, having an education is one of the biggest predictors of employment and also of positive health outcomes. So what do we do about it? I had the opportunity of being a doctoral student and of having this time to dedicate my passion and my time to working on this. And kind of the model that I took was a universal mental health promotion model. And so a way that I like to kind of describe this is by saying that society is best served by assisting all of us in maintaining mental health rather than trying to foresee which of us is most likely to act out when mental health support is not readily available. And part of why I addressed it in this way is because, as Stuart mentioned, we don't have enough resources to meet all the needs of students. And so even when students do come in to get accommodations, they're getting accommodations specifically for their academics, and then we send them on their way. But what about developing skills? What about things that are going to help them succeed in their classes and succeed in life afterwards? And so they're also facing barriers to utilizing these services. So let's say a student is already on medication for a psychiatric diagnosis, and then they come to the disability office, and you're asking them to prove that their disability is having distinct impact on their function. But it's not at this point because they're already having medication. So they can't qualify for having a disability, and so they leave the disability office. But now they're not going to get an accommodation that they need. So I took this idea of using a universal mental health promotion model to address the needs of more students, but also to say that any student can benefit from this. And what can it look like if we address the needs of all students in a really accessible way? So the way that I did that was, for my doctorate in occupational therapy, I developed a course. And so I said, what would it look like if we embedded these topics into a course and we didn't require students to seek services outside on their own? So already we know, when you look at the American College Health Association data, students are stressed. They're more stressed than ever before. They have less time, they have more anxiety, higher rates of depression. So how can we reduce the strain on them to get the services that they need? So I developed a course curriculum for undergraduate students. My goal was specifically initially to provide it to students that had disabilities, but I didn't limit it to students that were registered with the disability office. But I wanted to see what would it look like if I developed a class that addressed the skills for well-being and self-management and gave students course credit to learn those skills. Could that make a difference? Could that be a complement to the services that are already provided on campus? Could it make a difference in what their skill set is moving forward? Can it make a difference in their mental health? So I did deliver this curriculum to 11 students and then attempted to measure the impact of it through both qualitative and quantitative data. It really did focus on supervised skills practice. So that's the idea of, instead of me standing up here and saying, I'm the expert and I'm gonna tell you what's good for your mental health and you're gonna listen to me blab about it, we're gonna practice those skills in class and you're gonna have an opportunity to get direct and immediate feedback on what those skills look like. Some of the things that we addressed in the class were time use, stress management, mindfulness, managing emotions, the impact of movement and food on your cognition, on your learning, effective communication with professors, with peers, sleep hygiene, your identity, both as an individual and in terms of disability identity, advocacy, self-advocacy, and other well-being topics as well. So I think it's difficult to read up there, but it's more or less what I just talked about. But I think if you think about your own education, so if you think about when you went to elementary school, middle school, high school, if you went to college and after, at any point along that trajectory of your education, did you have a class where you learned skills to take care of yourself? Did you ever have a class where someone taught you what it looks like to identify your triggers for when you're stressed? And then when you do identify those triggers, what do you do about them? What are your coping mechanisms? What do you do if you're having a problem with a peer? How do you communicate that effectively? What strategies work for your own well-being? And so if you didn't have an opportunity to take a class like that, which I know I never did, I stumbled into a positive psychology class towards the end of college that started to introduce things, but especially if you studied psychology or medicine, we often talk about how do we help other people with their well-being. But at any point along that trajectory, did you learn how to take care of yourself? And so college is this place where we tell students, give us your money and we will educate you to be highly successful and productive people. But we're only educating them for really specific things. We're teaching them to have specific interests and skills in one area, and we're not teaching them how to take care of themselves. And so you might have a student who's brilliant. Maybe they can ace any statistics exam, or they're a brilliant composer. But if they don't have the skills to take care of their own mental health and well-being, their talents and their intelligence is going to be a lot less useful to themselves and a lot less useful to the world. And so, enter my class. Did it work? I looked mostly at qualitative data. I do have a lot of quantitative as well, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about it as much. If you're interested, you can absolutely send me an email and I can share. But as I went through the qualitative data of what did these students say? So students took my class for 16 sessions. They learned more about themselves, about what it means to take care of themselves, about different strategies for well-being, connecting more to the idea of disability and seeking help and identity. And as I read through their responses from their evaluations, as I looked at what they said in a focus group, some of the themes that started to pop up were skill acquisition. So for an example, one student said, "This class provided me with the knowledge regarding mental and academic success that I would have never had. This is honestly the only class that has prepared me to live a better life and is actually applicable to everyday life." Another theme was enhanced confidence and personal control. Also, the prioritization of mental health and well-being. So, an example, this class made me actually set aside time in order to improve my well-being and mental health. Honestly, if I didn't get graded on it or have deadlines for it, I would have continued to neglect the current status of my mental health. Social and peer support, and also academic performance. And so even though I'm not going to go through all of the metrics, for me, one of the most telling quantitative pieces of data that I had was a simple question that I asked at the end of a post-survey, where I said, compared to 8 weeks ago, how do you feel about your ability to implement effective strategies to manage your physical health, your emotional health, and your academic student roles and responsibilities? And so I had 11 students, so 90% of them said they felt significantly more confident, and then one student said they felt more confident. So the benefits of a course model, one being you can reach a large subset of students. So this was a pilot course. I was also a post-professional clinical doctoral student. I think they felt like 11 was a good number. They didn't want to entrust me with too many my first go-around teaching. But you do have an opportunity, as many sections as you want to have, as many students as you can have in one class, depending on your resources, you are reaching a large subset of students at one time. It's also a really low cost to the university, so in my instance, free, but typically not so free, but you have one instructor, and then in addition to that, every student that's taking your class is paying tuition. It also reduces some of the barriers to utilizing services. So in one way, because students are taking a class, and so they saw a class online called Wellbeing. Am I interested in addressing skills to support my own mental health and well-being? Has a little bit less of a stigmatizing effect than walking independently to a counseling center and seeking services on your own. But in addition to that, once they're in the class, we spend a lot of time talking about stigma, talking about identity. So then when they leave the class, their ideas pertaining to seeking help have changed as well. So it's not just that the class, is a curing agent and then they don't want help anymore. It's that after they leave the class, they feel like they know who they are and they feel confident asking for help when they need it, and then moving forward can get services that they need. Also, opportunities for social engagement. So peers building relationships. The class is really communication-based, participation-based, And also, I didn't see students on their phones. They were talking to each other. We were having group discussions. Towards the end of the semester, I would see students start to trickle in, having driven to class together. So it was a great opportunity for students to start building friendships as well. I address things from a skills-based perspective. And so I'm sure many people here are mental health counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, and the work that you do is amazing. And similarly to Stuart, people who work in disability services, the work that they do is amazing. But then there's this kind of unmet need in the middle of who's addressing the needs and the skills of students to get through everyday life, and not just in their academics, but in social and then outside as well. That's going to carry them through their adult life. So there's kind of this in-between place where students aren't gaining skills, and this is an excellent opportunity for them to do that. One big thing, too, that was pointed out in the focus group, and just as I talk to students, is that having a course model communicates an institutional priority of well-being. So you're saying to these students, we as an institution, we as a university, we care the same amount that we do about your chemistry class, we care that same amount about your mental health. So much so that we're gonna offer you course credit to address it. And that really does kind of infiltrate a student's psyche to say, I have this professor who really cares about my well-being, who cares about how I'm doing, and the school is giving me credit to address my own mental health. And that can be a really big game changer as well. And having classes like this, integrating well-being and mindfulness and anything that's going to change a student's ability to take care of their own well-being really has the potential for improved health, academic success, increased retention throughout semesters, higher graduation rates, and then hopefully moving forward, employment and health outcomes as well. And then just one other thing I want to talk about too is often when I go to conferences related to mental health, there are not a lot of occupational therapists there, and this is not necessarily as traditional of a practice area for OTs, but moving forward as we try to look for as we try to integrate more innovative models of practice into how we're meeting student needs, I think thinking about occupational therapy is an excellent place for it. So we have a practice framework, and within the practice framework, our purpose is articulated as enhancing or enabling participation in roles, habits, routines in home, school, workplace, community, and other settings. And so when you look at what students need, that they need more help with their day-to-day, they're not following through with goals that they need, they don't have skills to support their own mental health and well-being, occupational therapy is an excellent practice, an excellent way to meet this unmet need. Moving forward. And so now the models for successful transition from high school to college to workplace, Dr. Victor Schwartz, the Chief Medical Officer of the JED Foundation. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. And we're out of time, so I'm going to sit down. No, I'll try to be quick, though, to leave us time for some questions and comments. I wanted to focus on two important moments in the path of a young person as they're going from high school to college and college to the workplace. Because for people with chronic and serious illness or mental illness, these are times where things can easily go off the rails. And in many cases, we don't really pay enough attention to how we can do a better job in making sure young people have a smoother pathway. The movement from high school to college in terms of this concern, we can think about in two pieces. When kids are thinking about where to apply, they're looking at U.S. News and World Report and talking to their friends, and all kinds of things are going on, but they aren't often seriously enough considering the impact that illness or disability might have on their choice. And this has been alluded to before, but if you think about it, when students are failing in school or not making it to graduation, it's typically not because they can't handle the academic work. More often than not, obviously finances in the United States are a major problem, but in many, many cases, what you're seeing is the impact of psychosocial problems, and in many cases, they're overwhelming and haven't been adequately addressed. So just to make you aware of a resource, Jed developed a program. It's an online resource called Set to Go. You can find it at settogo.org, and it's actually focused on this transition from high school to college. You can find a tremendous amount of stuff, and I'm just going to give you a couple of pieces of information. But in thinking about college choice, we're encouraging young people and their families to think about the array of services, whether there are services on campus and in the community that can address the needs that the student might have. And there's a lot of stuff you can find on schools' websites when you're going on campus tours. Even the tone of how engaging and how open the school is to talking about their student affairs and their Office of Students with Disabilities, their leave of absence policies. Are they easy to find on the school's website? These are the kinds of things that can give you a handle on whether the school is going to be a kind of reasonable fit. And we use this term. We have a worksheet on the Set to Go website. It gives you a way of walking through this decision-making process and thinking about whether the school has the array of resources and other things too, like distance from home. So for a kid who might be more brittle, needs more ability to maybe come home on a weekend, or again, resources that are set up close to home, it might be a better idea to be in a school where a movement and a visit back home is an easy thing. So once you've made the decision and hopefully been accepted somewhere, there are other things that are important to consider. And again, for a young person who may need ongoing treatment, there are a bunch of decisions to be made about who's going to manage the treatment, how is it going to be handled, will it be on campus, will it be some mix of people back home and on-campus resources, and all of that ideally can be worked out before a young person goes to school. So making these plans and making sure they're in place. Remember, once a student's been accepted, they can't be de-accepted because they come out and talk about having a disability. So once you're in the school, you can work with the disabilities office, you can work with student services, you can work with the counseling service to make sure that you have a plan that really is coordinated down to if there's need for medicine, where's that going to come from? How's that going to be handled? Most counseling services don't provide ongoing care. So for somebody who needs longer-term care, there needs to be some kind of plan in place. There should be plans for crises as well, right? So you need both a plan that handles, again, access to all of the specialty care that might be necessary, and management of crises. And an important piece of this is thinking through how are you going to communicate, both in a routine basis and when there's a crisis. So, problems will come up. There need to be plans, and these things can be worked out ahead of time. Again, on the Set to Go website, you can find a document we developed with NAMI, which is called Starting the Conversation, and it discusses actually how you can make a kind of advanced directive and work these things out with the student, with clinicians and services at home and in the school. So you should make sure that these plans are in place because it's prevention is better than dealing with a crisis. So again, you can find this on the Set to Go website. The other important transition moment, and this quote, I'm not going to read it to you, but the point is that we don't think enough about the transition out of college and into the workplace, particularly for students who might have emotional, mental health, or other chronic illnesses. This other long quote, this stuff will all be up on the website right after the conference, so you can go back and read these. But the point is that the job market has become more demanding and more stressful and less predictable than it was 20 and 40 years ago. And this is having a major impact on the transition for young people out of college. People are changing jobs and moving around more in their first 10 years of their work life than they ever did before. And people are certainly unsure about what work is going to look like. We did a project and will hopefully soon be putting out a white paper, which will be on our website, looking at some recommendations about what schools can do. We did this project with the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research at the University of Massachusetts. So we did a survey of, as you see, a number of both college seniors, early career folks, and employers, asking about the sort of overlap of mental health concerns and the transition to the workplace. We did a lit review, which was actually very easy because there was no lit to review, it turned out. We tried to understand what was happening. Was anybody actually thinking about how to coordinate between career services, who might have been good to have somebody here, but we would have even been more out of time. So what did we find out? I just want to highlight these, really the last two bullets here, which is folks found it hard to maintain their friendships and found it harder to make new friends in their work than they anticipated. Actually, it's the second and third that I want to highlight. But for people who had a mental health diagnosis or mental health problem, they didn't think about this in relation to, their job search and where they were going to move. And, in many cases now, you may be in a place in a school where you do have access to resources and support, and then find yourself suddenly out in some place where, it's much harder to find care. So we really think that it would be important for folks to really think about this and consider it if they have an ongoing problem, if they have a serious concern. You need to weave these things in. What we'd also like to see, and what we're hoping to try to get schools to think about, is more communication between counseling services and career offices, so that career offices need to be more cognizant of the mental health needs of their students. And, the people in the counseling service, when they're dealing with people who are heading towards the end of their undergraduate careers or the end of graduate careers, need to be thinking about, what should the school be recommending, and what are helpful ways to have the student think about that transition from school into the workplace, and how they need to really factor in their mental health concerns. And, of course, employers ought to be taking this into consideration and trying to address these things. Most employers thought they were doing a good job, but most people think they do a good job in most things, and it isn't necessarily true. But clearly, the young people weren't always feeling as supported and understood as maybe ideally should be the case. So I'm going to hand it back over to Dorothy, and who's going to wrap things up. Thank you.
Thank you, Vic. We're going to move straight to questions. Got some here. I hope that we've done a decent job helping to not just heighten awareness about this issue and improve transparency and help you understand a little bit more about the different people and perspectives that are involved in the process. And in the case that we haven't, let's do as many questions as we can. When it's time to cut us off, just say the word, Stephanie. Okay, so here we go. With regard to workplace evaluations and accommodations, how common are these? Is there still significant stigma against an employee who may seek an evaluation or accommodation for a mood disorder? And are individuals required to disclose that they will seek this evaluation during the interview process? I'm going to ask Dr. Saragoza to address this one.
Are these on?
Should be.
Yeah. They're pretty common. I would say that a lot of workplace issues are handled unofficially without an examination, though. So what happens frequently is that an employee who is having some kind of issues just approaches a supervisor that they have a good, trusting relationship with, explains to a superficial extent what's going on, and requests some sort of temporary off-the-books kind of measure, and it gets handled that way. So that is very common. When people get sent for an examination around disability, the most common scenario for such an examination is that they have filed for medical leave, usually with the person who's their primary treating clinician supporting the need for that leave. And the people who hold the purse strings of the benefits are requesting some sort of independent assessment. Less common is that somebody is actually exhibiting quite a bit of impairment at work, and the people who are in charge of supervising them notice this and think that they may need to be evaluated to determine whether or not they're suitable to continue working. That's called a fitness for duty examination. And in that case, the person often wants to continue working. They're not asking for a leave of absence, and they're coming to the examination at the behest of their employer. So those are the scenarios, and I would say that certainly stigma affects each of those. There are people who are, of course, reluctant to disclose that they have some kind of condition that might be impairing them at work, and that may prevent them from approaching the supervisor for an unofficial accommodation, as I said before. The other thing that ends up happening is that people struggle with what is called presenteeism. That's a term from the literature meaning that they're basically working through impairment, and sometimes that can go on for quite a long time and create all sorts of ripple effect problems. They get perceived as problem employees, people who are having issues with their productivity, sometimes tardiness, attendance, things like that. And the disability doesn't really start to get discussed in an appropriate way until some kind of performance measure is taken against them, and they're kind of on a disciplinary track. So that is certainly a way that stigma manifests around these kinds of evaluations.
Thank you. I'm looking through these questions, and we have a big problem. There are way too many very good ones. We shouldn't be surprised given the complexity and nature of all the individuals speaking. One that I think might be helpful to address here is, do you have any thoughts about how treating clinicians can provide objective data to document functional disability outside of me, the psychiatrist, sending them for testing? You know, I think this is complicated. I'll briefly address this one and see if anyone else wants to elaborate. It's obviously a complicated situation. Sometimes having someone set up a separate appointment just for the purpose of having that discussion, especially in the context when there is either, you know, social security disability involved, or student services or disability office, where a treating clinician's input is adequate to justify an impairment. So you know, reviewing the forms carefully and allotting a separate section of time and providing some psychoeducation to an individual, excuse me, regarding the nature of that appointment, and that it might be different. And then also the alternative is, in certain situations it may make more sense to refer them out and seek the services of someone separate from the treating relationship to conduct an evaluation. Anything to add? Or okay, so
I'll add something.
please go ahead.
The one thing that I would add, and this is particularly towards clinicians, is one of the things to remember is we don't know the person you're working with, and we're only going to know them through the material you give us. So my advice is, give us a sense of what life is like for that person. Qualitative data is still good data. So I encourage you to, your job is to sort of give me a sense of what is life like for this person, and let me know that. And that's what I would just add.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you for that contribution.
And I would just quickly make 30 seconds. Please. That, particularly working with students, you can't really do an assessment without understanding what impact their symptoms or problems are having on their ability to study, on their ability to to learn, to sit in class, to concentrate. So you actually do need to be asking about this, because again, you'll make decisions about whether to start medicine, for example, now or after midterms, based maybe significantly on their functional impairment at this moment.
The next question, I think, is also a very good question to help clarify some of the things that we've talked about today. The diagnoses in the DSM-5 are based on whether or not one's everyday activities are impaired, and you've stated there's a difference between mental health diagnosis and those who qualify for accommodations. By the DSM's determination of a diagnosis, wouldn't all mental health diagnoses meet the requirements for accommodation? Anyone, any takers?
I'll go.
Please.
Theoretically speaking, that's true. Practically speaking, that's not always the case, so that some people may in fact have a diagnosis, but the diagnosis doesn't in fact impair them. A lot of these disorders, they're not homogeneous. They're very heterogeneous. So they can impact people in very different ways and in very different settings. So the idea is that a diagnosis alone is not enough to sort of get you the accommodation. The other part of it is clinicians are all human, and we may look at different things and have our own different thresholds, at which point we might make a diagnosis or what we consider to be impairment or not.
Yeah, and depending upon the benefit or accommodation that somebody is asking for, the standard that it's judged by might not be universal either. So some things are very stringent. For example, a lot of long-term disability policies have something akin to requiring the person to be so impaired as to really not be able to engage in a certain activity meaningfully at all, whereas something more temporary or short-term has a softer standard that accounts for a lesser degree of impairment. So the standards vary too.
And in making accommodations, you want to drill down more carefully and more precisely so that the accommodation actually fits the specific level of and quality of the impairment.
So yeah, so one specific example that I just occurred to me is, for example, if someone has a panic disorder, a social anxiety disorder, it may have no relationship whatsoever in their ability to function in completing a physics degree and working in the lab and
Might actually help them.
Yeah, it might help them, right? Okay, so next, here's a good question. At the university where I work, the therapist and psychiatry clinicians do the disability letter for students who want academic accommodations, as is the case in many settings. Should the student be evaluated by a forensic psychologist or psychiatrist? I'll briefly address, and I think case by case situation. In a perfect world, yes. In the reality, I think that there are certain circumstances when it might be more useful than others, such as, like Dr. Saragoza talked about, when there is some disagreement, for example, or when the clinician is feeling uncomfortable, or the student might feel uncomfortable about addressing this with the clinician. Is there something to add?
If the issue at hand is sort of at the edge or outside the scope of the clinician's expertise, that's another issue. And I had mentioned before, there are times where the agency that is controlling the purse strings on whatever the benefit is will actually have requirements about the qualifications of the person performing the evaluation. So I think that there's conflict of interest and discomfort issues as well as expertise issues at times.
Good points. Something else? Sorry, one more question? Okay. So yeah, I see that. It's okay. So there's a question here that I think actually really should be addressed as our last question, because I do think there's so many aspects. We've talked about legal situations. We've talked about the impairment, the trajectory of people who don't make it through school, or the chronicity of mental health diagnoses. And I think it can come off as very doom and gloom, despite the fact that all of us have an interest in treating and addressing and assisting people who have psychiatric or psychological concerns. So this question is, do students registered with SSD go on to succeed in the workplace where they have less supportive accommodations? If not, are there tools that can be given to them to help them succeed on their own with less support? So this is a very scary time, and I think this question really gets at a very important issue. And I'm wondering if, my reaction is yes, of course, but I'm wondering if other people are inclined to elaborate on this
I'll elaborate.
Critical.
And here's the good news. So this is a good question to end it on. The last time that we did this work a couple years ago, I can tell you this. Students registered with our office have a mean GPA of a 3.0, have four-year graduation rates of 80%, and have employment rates that are exactly on parity as graduates without disabilities. So the message that I want to leave you with is students with disabilities, with mental health disabilities, come to the university, they do well, they graduate, and they find work.
Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate your attention, all the thoughtful questions, and apologies again for those questions that we weren't able to address. Thank you.
Thank you.